I'm going to take a deep breath, but not too long a breath because I want to make this quick so I can turn this over to John Friedman. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. John Friedman as our first Provocation speaker of the Opportunity Institute. We've intentionally titled these sessions Provocations and not Keynotes because we hope that they provide a moment of disruption in your thinking. The work of the Institute, your work, is strikingly diverse, with teams from a broad range of institutions tackling a wide range of projects. But what all the projects have in common is a recognition that something at the system level, at their institution or in the greater education ecosystem, is posing a barrier to student success. And the team is working to find a solution that mitigates or eliminates that barrier. In effect, we're all seeking ways to disrupt the status quo. So it seems only right to feature talks that are themselves instances of disruption. And John Friedman is the perfect person to provide us with an example of disruptive thinking. John's had many titles in his illustrious career as a public economist, both in academia and the federal government. He served as special advisor to President Obama for economic policy on the White House's National Economic Council. He's been a professor of economics and public policy at both Harvard and Brown, and he's a founding co-director, along with Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren, of Opportunity Insights. The latter is perhaps how he might best be known to this gathering through its role over the past 6 years using massive data to identify both barriers to social mobility and scalable solutions. Their work has been transformative to the questions we ask, the ways in which we seek answers, and to the collaborative work that we do to take action. Education as an engine of social mobility is the key focus of their work. In a seminal paper published last summer, Diversifying Society's Leaders, the Determinants and Causal Effects of Admission to Highly Selective Private Colleges, John and colleagues focused on the data that we use to shape admissions policies to bring more talented students into higher education. We're in a disruptive moment in higher education, particularly with respect to admissions, and John's insights are particularly important at this time. Please join me now in welcoming John Friedman to the Opportunity Institute. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation to join you, and thanks for everyone who's participating from your particular institutions. Excited to spend the next hour or so talking about a data-driven approach to increasing college access. And so, hopefully this is less a provocation in the sense that it's striking or disruptive in a bad way, and more that it encourages you to think about how you can use some of these tools that are increasingly becoming available to make progress towards your goals at your institutions. So, Heidi offered an introduction that I think really dovetails nicely with what I wanted to say, which is exactly that I want to start by exactly motivating with that same question: how can universities be engines of upward mobility for their students? And where our work has taken us is not just in using big data to understand the broad sweep of the challenge in American higher education writ large, but also to try to show how we can diagnose what are the particular barriers that arise in individual contexts in a way that recognizes that there are many, many different circumstances that different institutions find themselves in across not only the broad landscape of American higher education, right? Of course, a community college is going to be facing very different barriers than a selected four-year institution, but even among the schools that are here today, which are relatively similar, there are still really important differences depending on exactly the way you focus, the way that students come to you, the particular place in your state or regional or national educational setting. And so it's, I think, even more important than ever to really understand what are the barriers for your particular circumstance, and then what policies might help overcome those barriers. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. So just to motivate things from the start, right? I think it's just always good to have a basis. What is the upward mobility in the first place? What is it that we are trying to change? And I think that Heidi posted in the chat. I am delighted to take questions as we go, especially if something's not clear. If I'm laying out the method, would much rather have you ask a question, either drop a question in the chat or just speak up. Honestly, we can talk through it then, and then we can talk a little bit more about kind of applications and policy uses when we get towards the end. So I'll start with just one institution. I know there are a lot of folks from different campuses at Penn State here. So here is what we call the mobility report card from our work 7 years ago, measuring mobility at Penn State. And this is combining all students across all the campuses, right? That's just a data issue with how we see the data. Obviously, one could do it for specific campuses using different data. So the first part of understanding Penn State's effect on upward mobility is to think about where students are coming to Penn State from. Here I'm thinking about the income distribution, but you can do it across many different characteristics of students. And what you see is, and this is not uncommon for state flagship campuses like Penn State, there are many, many more students coming from higher income versus lower income families. Each of the 5 bars represents the fraction of Penn State students that come from a particular quintile of the parent income distribution. And so, right, mechanically, there are the same number of students nationwide. I'll get to norming locally in a second. There are the same number of students nationwide who are in the bottom bucket, the lowest parent income quintile. These are students effectively growing up in families earning at the poverty line or below. Only 5% of students, though, at Penn State come from such families, compared with 44% of students from the top quintile. Those are families earning more than about $110,000 a year. And you can even look in somewhat more detail. Here are families from the top 5% and the top 1%. And actually relatively few students from the top 1% at Penn State. The second half of this is thinking about where these students, thinking about each background differently, what are their outcomes once they leave Penn State? And here we're measuring outcomes looking about 10 years after students enroll. And again, it doesn't matter that exactly what statistic you use. The one that we're going to use here are the fraction of students who make it into the top quintile of earnings for as compared to other students in their cohort. These are students earning more than about $60,000 a year at about age 30. So you have to have a good solid job for that, but this is not about becoming a hedge fund manager or a corporate lawyer. There are lots of jobs that get there. And what you see here too is that there are important disparities. Students from higher income families are much more likely to end up in these jobs providing economic security. Just more than half of them do, compared with only 30% of students coming from low-income families. Now, I could show you from our data, the same picture for lots and lots of different colleges, but just as a way to summarize this, how upward mobility is being affected, I'm going to focus on students from the bottom income quintile. Again, that's, particular choice is not important. And I'm going to just pick out these 2 numbers. So access for these students are students, 5% of students coming into Penn State are from this bottom income quintile, and 30% of those students end up earning more than about $60,000 as adults. And you can locate Penn State on this graph where I've got access on the horizontal dimension and this success measure on the vertical dimension. So here's where the Penn State dot would go, and we can compare that to here's all the other about 2,500 Title IV institutions in the country. And more generally, you want to be up and to the right on this graph. So you can see that there's kind of a mass of schools that tend to trade off access and success. Schools that have more students from low-income families tend to be those schools like community colleges with more access. Those are going to be down on the right. As you get to more and more selective schools, you get further up, but typically on the left, that is, students get higher outcomes, but there are many fewer of them coming from low-income families. Penn State is kind of most of the way in this cloud up to the left. But you can see that there are some schools that come out of the cloud up and to the right. So those are schools like SUNY Stony Brook. Now that's another very selective, research-oriented institution that's both having a much broader distribution of students who are attending, and students are achieving quite strong outcomes as once they leave school. And so, while Penn State is doing pretty well, how can Penn State increase its impact on upper mobility? Well, it can do so in one of two ways, or both, right? It can try to broaden access. So that is to include a broader range of students that would move the dot out to the right, or it could increase success for the given students. It could, propel them further into these jobs of economic security. That would involve moving the dot up. And there's no kind of right or wrong way to do this. Today, I'm going to focus on how we can figure out how to move this dot over to the right. But I know that many of you are working on projects that are more focused on success. That would be moving the dot up for given students. Both approaches, I think, are important ways. In some sense, we really need both of them if we want more schools in the U.S. to look like SUNY Stony Brook. So having set that as the challenge, how are we going to use big data to figure out what's going on here? And so that brings us to the second step. And to do this, we're going to try to use the data to break things down using what we call the pipeline approach. Now, the motivation here is that the policy response that you're going to want to increase access depends a lot on where in the pipeline you have leakage. So, for instance, we know that there are, very large differences in students' achievement levels coming from different family backgrounds, even, by the end of high school or the point of high school where they're potentially applying to your institutions. And the types of policies that are going to change those differences in achievement levels, like more investment in K-12 schools, those are very different than if the lack of access is coming more from aspects of the applications and admissions process where a given student is figuring out where to go to college. And so we're going to first start by breaking things into what's being driven by end of high school differences in achievement levels and what's being driven by these three latter steps with the logic that, each of these are very important, but the steps of the pipeline that you as universities likely have the most direct potential to affect are these applications, admissions, and matriculation patterns. And then we'll seek to disaggregate further in there. Now, how are we going to do this? The goal here, again, is just to separate out those disparities that arise due to differences in school quality or other environmental factors, right? There's a lot of evidence suggesting that, very different experiences for children in the first 18 years of their life. And so in order to separate those factors out from the parts that are really inside the application and admissions process, we're going to try to construct that same type of graph that is understanding the rates at which different students come to a given institution, but comparing students with the same level of academic preparedness measured at the end of high school. Now, there are many different ways to do this. Really due to the data that's available, we're going to use test scores today, SAT and ACT scores. Now, those those will certainly be an imperfect measure of students' academic preparedness, and there's nothing wrong with doing this in other settings using either localized test scores or high school grades. It's more about the method that I'm after here. And so I'm going to introduce this by showing you a couple of results from the paper that Heidi mentioned that we put out last summer. That was really focused on Ivy Plus institutions, and then I'll show how it applies to schools that are here with us today. So what this graph shows is two different plots. So in green, that's plotting the distribution of students who are attending Ivy Plus colleges. And you can see it's got this very, very spiked pattern where a very large share of students come from very high income families, right? Almost 30% of students are coming from the top 1% of families. Now, what I've plotted in blue, that's just plotting something very simple. It's the fraction of students nationally in each parent income group with SAT scores above 1300 or ACT scores above the corresponding value. And so what you can see is the blue line is sharply increasing as well. Students from higher income families are more likely to get higher SAT and ACT scores. And we're going to chalk that up to stuff that's happening before the applications and admissions process. But what you see is that even though the blue line is upward sloping, the green line is much, much steeper, especially at the top. So another way of saying that intuitively is that high income students, yes, they're more likely to get top SAT scores, but they're even more likely to be attending Ivy Plus colleges. And that extra high attendance rate is reflecting differences that must be arising in the application and admissions process. So intuitively, we're just going to take the green line and divide it by the blue line. In practice, we're doing something that's a little bit more complicated. We're exactly matching, we're kind of creating a version of the blue line that exactly matches the distribution of test scores of students attending a given university. So we're kind of exactly matching the level of academic preparedness. And you get a line like this. And so one way to interpret this is each dot is showing you how likely are students from a given parent income background to be attending these Ivy Plus schools relative to others across the parent income distribution with the exact same test score in the range of test scores of students that attend these schools. And so what you see is you get this U-shaped pattern, albeit one where the right side of the U is a lot higher than the left side of the U. At Ivy Plus schools, for students coming from the very lowest parent income quintile, those students actually are as likely as you would expect, given their distribution of test scores, to be attending Ivy Plus institutions. But it then falls as you get towards the middle of the income distribution. So students from about the 60th or 70th percentile of the income distribution, these are families making both between $50,000 and $100,000 a year, they're 22% less likely to attend these schools than you would expect given their test scores. And then it increases very sharply as you get on the right. Students from the top 1% of family income are 80% more likely to be attending these schools than you would expect just given their test scores. And so this is representing the differences in attendance rates that are coming about relative to test scores, and therefore as a result of the application and admissions process. So let's, this is just some, pooling all these schools in the Ivy Plus together. But, we've actually posted on our website a bunch of data for individual schools, so you can do the same thing. And more generally, this is something that many schools are able to do something similar to in their own internal data. So what do you get? Here are 4 schools that are 3 schools that are attending here today, and then I've put in MIT as a baseline. And so what you see here for both Georgetown and Duke, you see that you get a very, very similar pattern to what we saw for these Ivy Plus institutions, with a very sharp spike up on the right, albeit without that U coming up on the left. Students from really everywhere below about the 90th percentile of the parent income distribution here are about 20% less likely to be attending these schools than you would expect just based on test scores. And then it spikes up, well above 2.5%, sometimes 3% as you get towards the very top of the income distribution. MIT looks very different. MIT is almost a flat line here. That's saying that no matter where you are in the parent income distribution, you are about as likely to attend MIT as somebody else, comparing two students with the same test score. An American university falls somewhere in the middle, again, still with this quite sharply upward sloping pattern. And more generally, I'll show you a graph later, you tend to get this spiked pattern up on the right for private schools. You see something very different, though, when you look at public universities. Public universities have a much different slope. So here's, again, the same graph. So you see, I think, kind of three different shapes here. So in green, that's University of Michigan, which actually looks pretty similar to some of the private institutions. In purple and yellow, those are data from the University of Iowa and the Ohio State University. I've watched too many college sports to miss that one, Heidi. And then in dark blue is UC Riverside, which has this very sharply declining pattern. Now, these are all students, and one can, of course, for public universities, you're going to want to think differently about in-state and out-of-state students. And that's not just because the students are, facing often a very different application and admissions process as in-state students, but also it's a very different national pool as opposed to the in-state pool for the in-state students. And so we can then do the same thing, now focusing only on in-state students. This does the same test score comparison. So we're comparing across students, think of it as across the parent income distribution, students that have the same test scores in the range of test scores for students that attend these institutions, but only coming from an institution's home state. So for instance, in the green line, that's looking only at students coming from the state of Michigan. And now Michigan actually doesn't really look like that, like the private school anymore. Michigan looks much more similar. It's got this kind of broad, elevated access levels, elevated attendance rates for students coming from about the top 10% of the income distribution, as we see at Iowa and Ohio State. UC Riverside still has this very sharply declining pattern. And so, as I said, these patterns are very similar to those that we see more nationally. So here's a comparison, the green are the Ivy Plus schools, the yellow are a group of flagship public universities that we have data on. And so that kind of broad hump shape, even declining at the very, very top of the income distribution, that's a very common pattern for public flagship universities, even though, as I'll show you, there are important differences. So we've now isolated what's going on in the part of the access pipeline that universities can affect perhaps most directly, separating it out from these very large disparities in academic preparedness that arise through differences in schools and other factors, but kind of before the application and admissions process starts. We can now go to the third step of thinking about where in that pipeline are these differences arising. And here too, we see very important differences across different institutions. And so again, we're now going to move from this first step to think about what's going on with application rates. And again, here I'm going to separate application from admissions and matriculation rates together. And you can continue to separate those if you want to drive the analysis further. So you've already seen this graph. This is just showing the attendance rates for these four private institutions. I'm now going to do the same thing and just ask, again, comparing students from different parts of the parent income distribution with the same test score in the right range. How often do they apply to each of these four schools? And recall that Georgetown and Duke were looking very, very similar in terms of the overall attendance patterns, but here they start to look somewhat different when we focus just on application patterns. So in green, Georgetown has much, much higher rates of application. Students from the top 1% of families are more than twice as likely to be applying to Georgetown compared with students from the rest of the parent income distribution with the same test scores. Students at the very bottom of the parent income distribution are about 20% less likely to be applying to Georgetown. Now, Duke has application rates that are increasing with family income, but much, much less so. Students at the very top of the parent income distribution are only about 40 or 50% more likely to be applying to Duke. And students at the bottom of the parent income distribution, they are less likely to apply to Duke, but again, they're only about 10% less likely rather than 20% less likely. So when we think about what part of that pipeline is explaining these disparities in attendance at Georgetown, a lot of it here is being driven by application rates. And the same is true if you look at American University. American University has very similar steeply sloped application rates. Students from the top of the parent income distribution are much more likely to be applying to American University. And so if this is what's going on for application rates, if you think about what's left over, that's going to be the combination of admissions and yield or matriculation, right? So because Duke had much smaller disparities in application rates, here you see there are much larger disparities in application and admissions rates. And correspondingly for Georgetown and American, here you see that that admissions and matriculation rates are almost flat across the parent income distribution. So that then points to two very, very different policy responses, right? Georgetown, it's really all about trying to increase applications from students more broadly throughout the parent income distribution, whereas Duke, the issue is really that the admissions process and the student yield from previous work, it's really being driven by the admissions process. They're just admitting students much more when they come from the top of the parent income distribution. So that's pointing to two really very different policy solutions for what in the overall attendance patterns looked pretty similar. And we can do the same thing thinking about the public schools. So again, here's the in-state attendance rates that you see before. What does it look like if we focus first on application patterns? Well, here, what we're seeing is that most of the overrepresentation of low-income students, the underrepresentation of high-income students at UC Riverside is coming from the fact that these students either are applying much more from the low end of the parent income distribution, or they're just applying much less at the high end of the parent income distribution. There are, the application patterns are actually quite similar across these three institutions, Michigan, Iowa, and Ohio State. And so what you're going to see is then while admissions and yield patterns, they're kind of smaller disparities at UC Riverside, we see that in Iowa, the admissions and yield patterns are much higher for high-income students, and they're much about half the difference at places like Michigan and Ohio State. So I want to make sure to get to your questions. I just want to give you a flavor of how this analysis works. I'd say there are really two steps about how one can apply this in practice, right? The first is just to ask what is going on in your data, what matters for your institution. The answer is going to differ a lot. And then the second step, right, we kind of started out the analysis here. You can really dig deeper with more data, and the ways in which you're going to dig deeper are going to depend on where exactly the barriers seem to be arising, right? So if application rates are a driving force, you can ask, well, where is it in a state or in the country or in a county that application rates are lowest? What types of students aren't applying, and what can we do to get them to apply? If it's more about admissions and yield rates, well, you can distinguish between those two. And then you can ask, well, for those students who aren't being admitted or who aren't choosing to attend, why is that the case? Are admissions inadvertently favoring, many of the private institutions, our paper last summer showed that many admissions policies inadvertently favor students from high-income families, even compared to students from middle-income or low-income families with the same test scores, due to the relative importance of non-academic factors. And you can really, I think, use this approach to drill down, make sure you understand the problem is going to be solved, and make sure that it's not a one-size-fits-all policy that you're trying to apply in your institution. So let me stop there. I'm excited to take your questions in the remaining 20 minutes or so. Thank you again, Heidi, for the invitation to join.
John, thank you so much for that. I was furiously scribbling down notes, and I dropped a couple of links into the chat. I hope, John, those are the right links, maybe to steer people
I believe
quickly
they are.
to some of the Opportunity Institute. Those pages, folks, aren't the papers themselves, but they'll get you to the paper with a bit of an overview, and they'll also get you to the data, because all of these data are available both as raw data and then often with tools that you can go ahead and plug your institution in and take them over from there. I've got questions because I've invited you for selfish reasons here, John, too, because I've always wanted to talk to you about your data. But let me first open it up to see if others who have joined us here today have questions. I'm looking to see if anyone's raising their hand or has a question they want to drop into the chat. Okay, John, while we're waiting for that, I think one of the questions, and I know this is a question of interest to a bunch of folks who are joining us at the Opportunity Institute, has to do with transfer pathways. And I'm wondering to what extent the data that you're looking at, I presume, are kind of the initial data coming in. And I'm wondering if you've looked at transfer pathways and how schools' openness to transfer, encouraging of transfer is making a difference in some of these kind of maybe not at the first year level, but in terms of the eventual graduation data sets?
Yes, that's a great question. So in the answer differs actually a little bit depending on the part of the analysis. So in the initial data that I showed for Penn State, and more generally for some of the mobility report cards that we published in 2017, those data include transfers. And so, you know, to the extent that transfers are helping to shape the diversity of the student population, they'll be included there. In the analysis trying to break apart applications and other stages of the process that I ended with and that we published last summer, those did not include transfers, just because the admissions and application process is much different for transfer students than not. I think it would really require a separate analysis. But I think the broader lessons of what we see from the pipeline analysis really hold for transfer students as well. So obviously at some institutions, transfers are a much larger part of the student body than others. But the role that those transfers play in shaping the diversity of the student body, that also differs. So, I mean, just to give you an example, in the University of California system, this is a system kind of renowned for the very active transfer pathways, especially from community colleges into four-year colleges at either Cal State or the UC system. Transfer students are actually, on average, higher income than students who start at the statistic I know in particular comes from UC Berkeley. I've not checked at the other schools. At UC Berkeley, transfer students are actually higher income than students who start as first years. And so again, that's, you know, not to say that the transfer pathways are not a good thing. It's just that in that particular case, that is not helping to diversify student body. But at other institutions, that's likely to differ. And that's just because the exact type of students who end up in the transfer pathway, the particular set of colleges that are the best feeders into the transfer pathway, those are all going to differ by state or by system, even by region, to the extent that you know, community college students may be looking to attend four-year colleges more locally. And so I think even though we didn't include those students in the analysis I showed you today or we did last summer, I think a very similar approach would work, right? You want to think about who are the students that are able to transfer, right? Those are probably the ones who have perform to a particular academic level, either in a community college or in another four-year college in the state. And then what are the rates at which they're actually doing so? What are the rates at which they're applying? What are the rates at which they're being admitted? And that's going to help understand not just what the transfer system is doing overall, but to the extent that the school wants to really increase the contribution of the transfer system to its access pipeline, what are the particular barriers that are standing in the way?
John, that was so helpful because I think we often think about transfer pathways quite differently. And Brett's asked a question in the chat that he'll come back to, but I want to actually ask for the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. They wanted to know how flexible testing policies have weighed into your analysis. And they say that this was interesting, and thank you.
Yeah, so well, thanks so much. And yeah, obviously, it's I think a very active question is many schools that change their testing policies in the wake of the pandemic are trying to think about, now that we're past the pandemic in certain ways, what's the right testing policy? So again, I think that the answer differs quite a bit across circumstance. I've studied this question personally most at selected private schools. And at those institutions, what you tend to find is that when colleges allow students to apply without test scores, that increases the number of applicants considerably. It has a small effect on the diversity of applicants, although not a large one. And it has effectively no change on the actual set of students who are admitted and attend. I think that's being driven by a number of different factors. The first is that at many of those colleges, as I think we saw somewhat from the data here, application rates are not really the primary barrier to broader access. There's really a lot more that's happening in the admissions process itself. And because flexible testing policies are not directly affecting the admissions process, it tends to not have as large of an effect. The other factor that I've seen at those schools is that adopting a flexible testing policy, it increases the amount of strategery that goes into the application process, because it raises the question, should you submit a test score? At what test score level should I submit a test score? Depending on who I am, is the test score going to benefit me or not going to benefit me? That's a very complicated question, especially if schools are having admissions processes that are kind of very nuanced, which tends to be the case for these schools. And so, for instance, there's some data from Dartmouth, which some colleagues of mine have published, that suggests that Dartmouth is trying to give students from more diverse backgrounds kind of a leg up in the process by having higher admissions rates for students with slightly below average test scores. But the students who might benefit from that don't recognize it. That is, there are a decent number of students who have a test score that's below the college average, but where it's high enough where they would still benefit from including that test score in their application, because they are coming from somewhat of a disadvantaged background where, being evaluated in context, that test score is really good. But because they see that test score is below the college average, they're not submitting it. And so that makes it more difficult for those students to be admitted. It makes it more difficult for those colleges to find those students. So that's one way in which these policies can have an effect. I'd say more broadly, the data suggests that, that overall finding that test optional policies increase the diversity of the applicant pool a little bit, but not so much the diversity of the students who are attending. That seems to also have been true, at least for schools that adopted test optional policies before the pandemic. It's a little bit difficult to study the changes in the pandemic directly in a broad way, just because so much else was changing at the same time. But it wouldn't be surprising to me if at some schools where application rates really are the key barrier to broader access, if increasing application rates as a result of going to more flexible testing policies did have an effect. And so, I think for that policy, like with all these others, the key is to think about what the effects are locally, either by evaluating its effects directly in your own data, or by thinking about what the broader challenges are that your institution faces, and whether increasing application rate is going to be something that seems to help or not on that margin.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to take away from this that the University of Michigan has asked a question that's going to benefit Georgetown in your answer.
Yes.
Indeed, this is our barrier. Brett Einen asks a question in the chat.
I'd like to say, right,
oh,
so,
sorry.
I was just going to say, so right, it's actually, so Georgetown is a school that is rated, not just as I understand it, not just does it require testing, it requires its own testing, right? And so that's going to lead to a particular set of students applying, those who, you basically, you have to kind of know what you're doing in advance in order to take that test. And so I can see there exactly as you say, where opening up the pipeline to students who maybe aren't quite as aware in advance that this is kind of an extra step to take for Georgetown, it wouldn't surprise me that might have some effect on application rates in a way that would disproportionately increase applications for students from low and middle income families.
Okay, let's see. We've got two more questions here, John. Thank you. And I've got notes for Georgetown. Brett Einen asks about wants to know what the model shows about community colleges and economic mobility. And I'll say that Brett spent a good chunk of his career at LaGuardia Community College. So this question comes from a lifetime of experience.
Yeah, so the challenges that community colleges face are obviously quite a bit different than those at more selective institutions. If I can just go back to share my slides, I'm just going to go back up to this chart that I had earlier, right there. So Heidi, can people see my my cursor on the screen? Yeah, okay.
Sorry, yes, they can.
Tend to be, yes, great. Community colleges tend to be in this part of the cloud that comes out and to the right, albeit at lower levels of success. But what you see is that even among community colleges, there are not only huge differences, you see that there are very large differences in access rates. Much of that can be explained by differences in just who the local population is. Students are attending community college more locally, but some of it is not. And so I think to think about how this approach would work to increase access at a community college is mostly about norming the parent income distribution, or just more generally the distribution of students that you're getting to the those that are going to high school in the local area. Then I think where there's much more variation that's going to be left over is in this vertical dimension of success. You see enormous differences in success rates, and some of that is explained by differences in just economic opportunities across areas, but a lot of it isn't. So for instance, LaGuardia Community College, I forget exactly which one of these dots is, but the CUNY community colleges are really do amazingly well in a way that you do not see from community colleges, even in other areas like New York with relatively high salaries. And so I think a lot of the focus in terms of increasing upward mobility for community colleges is going to end up landing on finding either those programs or those student supports that really help propel students into more economic security. So I'm sorry, I don't have more to say about that in this presentation, but I think it's a fascinating area on kind of the other side of the coin, the increasing success part of upward mobility from college.
John, thank you for that answer. And I should be doing this all along, but I want to steer people to the idea that we have both a pre-recorded panel, but we also have a workshop coming up that actually deal with transfer pathways. And so that might also be of interest to folks if this particular question is of interest. For Ferdinand from The Ohio State University asks a question, which I think might be the last one we have time for. We only have a few minutes, but asks, does the data show which approach provides institutions a better ROI on their efforts? Increasing the number of lower income students versus improving the odds of current students from lower income households to a higher income level?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think, it's really important to remember that at the end of the day, these institutions are businesses, largely nonprofit businesses, but still, right, there's a financial dimension here where, we have to think about policies that are realistic, given the constraints. So I think the answer to that question is going to largely depend on the ROI on the success side. I think, depending, it's going to differ across institutions, but depending on your particular funding model, depending on the supports that are available, usually at the state level for students at different income levels, it's pretty easy to figure out what's the additional cost of adding students from low or middle income families to diversify the students attending a given school. And, I do think that one of the unfortunate aspects of the way we finance higher education in this country is that the reality is that it often costs schools more to accept a student from a lower income family than a higher income family. And, I think, more broadly, it would be great. And this is something that's, not so much a school level change, but something that I hope either states or the federal government can think about. It'd be really great to change the system so that those incentives were flipped, that it were not more expensive, that it were less expensive to accept students from more diverse economic families. But, that's the reality at the moment. So the ROI part on the access, that's relatively easy to calculate. What's much harder to calculate is what's the ROI of the success-oriented change. So in some cases, there have been relatively low-cost student support programs that have gone in. So for instance, at Georgia State, they have a program where they found a lot of students were dropping out as they got close towards graduation for lack of like a couple $100 to pay residual student tuition or fees or something like that, right? You just not enough money to pay the tuition bill in your 7th or 8th or 9th semester. And so they had a pretty small fund, which they put together to kind of help people close those gaps. It was a relatively small amount of money. We're talking about maybe $500 to $1,000 per student. And they saw huge increases in graduation rates, which then flow through to large increases in long-term success rates. And so, that's an example of what I think is a very, very high ROI type intervention. But, other interventions are going to be much more costly. So for instance, there's been a lot of focus on expanding pathways for students into particular occupational tracks. So for instance, nursing is one where, pretty reliable economic security for students who get trained in nursing. We have a shortage of nurses in this country. So from a broader healthcare perspective, that's something that states and the federal government are often very excited about. Nursing is just a very, very expensive degree. And so, that's something where it still may be something that we want to do. It still may be very impactful for not only the students themselves, but for the broader healthcare in a community. But that's something where the direct ROI measured as literally getting students into higher paying jobs, that may be a little bit lower. So I really think that it's going to depend on a lot on what the success innovation is.
John, thank you very much for that. I'm going to share my screen one last time here, folks, to simply first encourage folks to drop into the chat your thanks to John Friedman for joining us today. John, this was just absolutely brilliant. And I bet a bunch of teams' time this afternoon is going to be taken up looking into your tools and like pulling out their school's data. I want to remind people of just two quick things before we hop off. First is that tomorrow at noon, our second provocation speaker is joining us. My colleague here at Georgetown, Susanna McGowan, one of the co-organizers of the Institute, will be welcoming everybody into that space, and welcoming Darnell Cole will be joining us. And then on Wednesday, a half hour earlier, so it's 11:30 on the East Coast, sorry, West Coast folks, my other colleague here at Georgetown, Randy Bass, will be welcoming Dr. Mary Dana Hinton in to join us for that final provocation. What we have now, folks, is a brief break. And then we've got 3 concurrent workshops this afternoon. I encourage folks to go to Schedule, look up which workshop you're interested in, and then click that box, hop on into the Zoom link, and we'll welcome you there. The rest of the afternoon, then, we're just back to team time, which means you should be also thinking about coaches that you want to see. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. John, one more thank you for joining us, and we hope that folks have a very productive rest of the first day of the 2024 Opportunity Institute. Thank you.